Services for 5 minutes.
Let me thank the witnesses for their presence here today and for the hearing that we have had. It's important, I think, Mr. Spaulding, I'm going to focus on trying to not be redundant, but deliberate more with you on this process. First of all, I'm glad that the Founding Fathers added Article 5 to at least acknowledge as a democracy we should be prepared in times of absolute need for change or maybe crisis to effectively maneuver a process with 2/3 and 3/4 that might work on a serious need for change. I heard one member make an important point. I don't think it is a constitutional change, but what the Supreme Court does is it interprets the Constitution, and by its interpretation, of which I know that I've had extensive disagreement with the Supreme Court of recent years, one could say that they've altered constitutional law or decisions that were premised on constitutional law. And what comes to mind, of course, is the Shelby case that literally destroyed the Voting Rights Act that I think was grounded in the 14th Amendment, equal protection, possibly the 15th Amendment, and then, of course, due process. How they got to their decision of just eliminating voting protections, and of course, we have deteriorated and gone further down. But I think the issue of a constitutional convention is clearly should be perceived from the perspective of the representation of the American people. First, by way of states, and we have the 10th Amendment, what is not left to the federal government is left to the states, and then cities and hamlets and counties that have different jurisdictions as well. So my first question is, because of the system that we have, our states, our cities, counties, and hamlets, villages are dependent on the federal government. They do the government does major work from interstate highways, from the railroads. Now we've gotten into more modern issues of climate change. We see that crime is an issue across America. Cities and states are looking to have a partner in the federal government and how you work to bring down crime. Education has a component of the federal government. So what first of all, could you emphasize that dependency and that a balanced budget amendment, though well-intentioned, is distinctive from a city that balances budget, which people want to constantly say, my city balances its budget, and how does that in any way argue favorably for the national government to have that obligation?
I agree with you, Ms. Jackson Lee, wholeheartedly that many states, local jurisdictions depend on resources from the federal government to carry out their activities. One important point, we've heard about states having balanced budget requirements. States generally have an operating budget, which may be balanced. Then they also have a capital budget, which may include borrowing, which may include needing to dip into reserves that weren't raised that year. So I think there's some nuance there when we're talking about states abiding by balanced budgets, because in general there's two, and so that's a point that I appreciate having the opportunity to make.
So we can make the argument that local governments, state governments that balance their budget, there may be some unique focus that doesn't equate to a massive budget that the federal government has to utilize. Right. Based upon the needs of the American people. Lastly, very quickly, two of my colleagues were eloquent on this whole question of term limits. I think it is important to point out that the Founding Fathers rejected it. Give me your worst case scenario for the federal government, institutional memory gone, the massiveness of the government, the ability to have elected persons in the people's house be able to reflect what the people want as the government is guided by the executive. How important is the maintenance of the ability to elect who you chose and not have term limits?
It is incredibly important to have that continuity and that institutional memory. And it's also important to acknowledge people are frustrated. They expect a democracy that is representative and reflective and responsive. The challenge, in my view and in Common Cause's view, is not the length of a term, because there's tremendous wisdom and experience that comes with those who are closest to the people being chosen by the people. The challenge is it's the attacks on the freedom to vote, extreme gerrymandering, the influence of money in politics that has distorted representative democracy. We've got to fix those challenges. It's not term limits, but to your ultimate point, completely agree that term limits can increase the power of lobbyists and folks on K Street who are here a very long time as people rotate in and off of Capitol Hill. It undermines accountability because members who aren't facing re-election may take other votes potentially, but ultimately I think it undermines the freedom to vote and ultimately the people to choose who they would like to represent them in the halls of the legislature.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your indulgence. I just want to make one last sentence on the record. Ms. Spalding, you said it. It undermines the people's ability to run their government as they choose. We have to fix it and make it work, but it undermines the people, and I'm standing with the people, from cities to hamlets to villages to states. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to introduce that statement, and to the ranking member as well. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes myself for 5 minutes. We've got to answer some of this.